Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. When Tennesseans go to the polls and cast their vote, they do so with the hope that the person whose name appears on their ballot will do what's best for their community. They expect that person to show respect for the Constitution and the rule of law, and to protect the integrity of our most important institutions. The people place a great deal of trust in us, and I don't think it's too much to ask that we return the favor by recognizing that there are limits to how far the federal government can expand its reach. Now, many of my Democratic colleagues, however, would disagree with me on that premise. They returned to Washington this week ready to squander the people's trust on yet another power grab. The election bill they're prepared to break the Senate rules to pass has failed multiple times under multiple titles and in different packaging. This has gone on for the last 20 years. But this latest round has one thing in common with all the other drafts that found their rightful place in the trash can. It has nothing to do with protecting the ballot box. This is not a voting rights bill. It's a sweeping takeover of our democracy and a shocking attack on the constitutional authority of the states to determine the time, place, and manner of elections. That is right. This is not in statute. It is Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution. I've said it before, I'll say it again. These proposals read like something concocted by someone who has never stepped foot behind the scenes of their local polling place. It's concocted by people who probably have never spent 10 minutes as a poll worker carrying out and implementing election, and they absolutely have never served a term on a local election commission. It seems that our friends across the aisle are looking at all of these local elected and appointed officials that work elections and saying, we think that you just are incapable and inept to carry out an election. How disrespectful can you be? The federal government's got to come in and save the day and take away the ability of your local elections registrar to carry forward an election. I hope my colleagues will think about the message that they are sending, because there is nothing in these proposals that would help your state and local leaders secure elections. And in fact, many provisions would actually weaken the checks already in place against voter fraud. This is the opposite of how it should be. It should be easy to vote and hard to cheat, not the other way around. And the people of this country and elected leaders have been saying no to the federal takeover of elections for the past 20 years. But here we are again, having to once again stand up against this desperate attempt to undermine voters and empower cheats and criminals by mandating ballot harvesting while rejecting voter ID requirements. That is in their bill. Got to do it. Got to allow ballot harvesting. That's where shenanigans happen. Can't have voter ID requirements. No, no, no. We don't want anybody at the ballot box having to prove who they are. But be ready to show that ID if you want to get on a plane, if you want to get in a government building, if you want to go buy a bottle of wine, be ready to show that ID, prove your age, prove who you are. Their bill would also centralize power over elections in the hands of faceless, unaccountable bureaucrats. That's right, not your friends and neighbors working the polls and making decisions and serving on local election commission. You'll never know the people that say, hey, you're too stupid to figure out how to run these elections, because the Democrats are going to take all the power and authority away from your local friends and neighbors and send it to bureaucrats here in D.C. And they would embrace a one-size-fits-all rule book that any seasoned election worker knows will throw polling places into chaos. In my home county in Tennessee, we have people that have worked these polls for years. They're dedicated. They are good people. I don't know their political party. I just know that they show up to make certain that our elections are free and fair, and I appreciate them. Since the first iteration of this bill reared its head, the American people have seen it for what it is: an activist-driven, power-hungry solution in search of problems that do not exist. That's right. The problems don't exist. The Democrats want you to believe that America as we know it will end if they don't pass this bill. They are acting like elections are in crisis. But you know what, Madam President? I think maybe it's the Democrat Party that's in crisis. They're staring at decades-high inflation, crime spikes, cascading public health failures, a southern border on the verge of collapse, embarrassing approval ratings, infighting so intense that watching the nightly news feels like you're watching a soap opera. They can't get their arms around COVID, can't figure it out. I just heard coming over here, the CDC is now going to mandate that insurance companies have to supply home testing kits for all of their enrollees. I mean, yeah, I think it's a party in crisis. And you know what? The Democrats right now, they are desperate for a distraction. Oh, just give them something to change the narrative. And the benefit of this one, if they could pull this off, they won't have to worry about the American people holding them accountable for the fallout, because they now will control the ballot process. They will control the election commissions. And you know what they're saying to the American public? Your vote doesn't count. We have treasured one person, one vote. We have treasured fair, free, honest elections. And the Democrats are ready to throw it away for a power grab that is unprecedented and is incredibly disrespectful of the men and women in each of our counties that give of their time and work to hold these elections. This is more than just another example of partisan holding the Senate hostage. And it is partisanship. It is, we have to do this, take away power from the people. Oh, isn't it supposed to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people? But oh, I think my colleagues across the aisle have forgotten that. They think it is government for the powerful, government that is in control of one party and one party's agenda. That's what they're thinking. This attack on the integrity of our elections is a complete betrayal of the trust that the people have given elected officials, because we have colleagues across the aisle who are basically looking at their constituents in their various states and saying, your opinion does not count. Think about that. You're not good enough. You're not smart enough. You can't handle it. So, hey, federal government, we're going to come save you from yourselves. That is what they think. It is their constitutional prerogative to determine the time, place, and manner of their own elections. That is what is given to the state legislatures. It is their prerogative. And it is not the job of Congress or the president or a battalion of unelected, faceless, nameless, unaccountable bureaucrats to burn down the goalpost when things at the ballot box don't go their way. But that's exactly what the Democratic Party is trying to do this week. So you never will be able to complain to them. They want to hold all the cards. The purpose of this latest power grab isn't to make the people feel secure. Its purpose is to inject hysteria into what should be a very serious conversation about actually protecting the vote. Everything the people hear from the Democrats this week will have been scripted to minimize truth and maximize chaos. Remember, they want you to believe elections, they're in crisis. We have to fix it. But fortunately, Tennesseans and the American people know better than to hear, to believe what they are hearing on the nightly news, and to believe what is coming from the Democratic Party. They also know there's only one reason a political party would work this hard to make elections easier for them to manipulate. I yield the floor and notice the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Unfortunately, President Biden lost the opportunity to persuade the American people otherwise on day one of his administration, when he chose to turn the American Southwest into a free-for-all. Since then, things have only gotten more dangerous. During the first 4 days of this month, law enforcement officials arrested 3 members of MS-13, an 18th Street gang member, and multiple convicted sex offenders as they tried to enter the country. On July 6th, they seized more than 1,000 pounds of meth from one single smuggler. That's right, one smuggler. Do you think the drug dealers are emboldened? Think about that, 1,000 pounds of meth. So far this year, they've seized more than 8,000 pounds of fentanyl, which is enough to kill a small country. And here is the question I would pose to the president. How many people and how many pounds of drugs made it in while Border Patrol agents were busy with the smugglers and criminals they managed to catch? Where did the gotaways go? What did the gotaways have with them? Well, that is a rhetorical question. We know exactly where they went, and we know what they've got with them. And you know what, Madam President? They are coming to our own cities, communities, towns, our own backyards. My Democratic colleagues may be happy to ignore the problem, but on behalf of Tennesseans, I will not ignore the problem. The threat is too great. If you ask any law enforcement officer, they'll tell you this issue of the southern border, it is a matter of life and death. Not just on the border, Madam President, but in each of our 95 counties in the state of Tennessee, in each of our towns and cities. This open border is a matter of life and death. In Tennessee, our sheriffs and police chiefs want the border secured. And I've got to tell you, to so many Tennesseans, it is laughable that a White House spokesman would stand behind that podium and look at the people and say, the border is secure. Who do they think they're talking to? Do they think that people are not watching the footage? Whether they're watching it on TV or streaming it or looking at it on social media, Madam President, they can see that this border is not secure. They're talking to friends and relatives that live in a border state, that live along that border. And they're telling them some of the horrific stories that they're witnessing every single day in their communities. We know for a fact that the cross-border drug trade is alive and well. Who's getting rich off this open southern border? Take a guess. The drug cartels. The drug cartels. Enormous profits, growing to a global organization. That's right, global. So far this year, people from 150 different countries have come across our southern border. Chinese nationals, they're not trying to come in here on a visa. They don't wish us well. Chinese Communist Party, they're hard at work. Chinese Communist Party, they're paying the cartels $50,000 a pop to get people into our country that they want to, but bringing them across the southern border. The Tennessean, which is our newspaper in Nashville, Tennessee, recently reported a truly horrific story about a multi-million-dollar crime ring operating right out of Middle Tennessee. That's right. The drug cartels, they're not fearful because Joe Biden has the welcome mat out, border open. The kingpin was working directly with the Sinaloa drug cartel. Now, that is the one that primarily has the Arizona border. That is the one that is bringing a majority of the drugs through Arizona. They like to focus on fentanyl. And the traffickers that were working underneath this hoodlum are as brutally violent as their friends down in Mexico. We know they are responsible for multiple horrific assaults, kidnappings, at least one murder, and the mutilation of a 22-year-old woman. They're also linked to a local gang that terrorizes the streets of Nashville. That's right, a drug kingpin working directly with the Sinaloa cartel. And that is what they are doing in Tennessee. The violence does not stop at the border. The violence in this country increases because of that open border and because of the unwillingness of this administration to do anything about it. This violence is bleeding into every town, every state, and it will not stop until we have leaders in the White House and an administration who are willing to put themselves in between these monsters and the American people. The fact that we can't talk about this without provoking hysteria in the ranks of the Democratic Party tells me we're heading in the wrong direction. But don't take my word for it. Just read a number of the polls that are out there. I hope the president takes to heart that 33% job approval rating that the New York Times reported on today. That is about as significant a message as could be sent to this administration. Only 33% of the American people. Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. Over the past year, the Biden administration has put out some truly absurd propaganda, but last week they released something that was so over the top, I had to double check to make sure that it was real. Yes, of course it has up here that it was issued February 7th, 2 p.m., and it's going to expire June 7th of this year at 2 p.m. Had all the markings of something that was legitimate, but it is so outrageous that I confirmed that it was actually a government-issued document. And of course, I'm referring to the Homeland Security memo that is summarizing the current threats, the terror threat to the United States. Under normal circumstances, you would expect a threat assessment to be a helpful document. That's what we've come to expect. But in this case, it wasn't obvious before, but now it is so obvious. It is crystal clear that conventional definitions of the word normal no longer apply to this administration. If you have not read this, you will not believe your eyes. What makes it so uniquely infuriating is the case with which DHS used an official document to equate violent terrorists with Americans who refuse to fall in line with the Biden administration's narrative of the day. They did it so easily, just laying out their case of threat assessments to the United States. Alongside descriptions of actual violence and threats against churches and schools, DHS warns of, and I quote, the proliferation of false or misleading narratives which sow discord or undermine public trust in U.S. government institutions. The bulletin specifically identifies, and I quote, widespread online proliferation of false or misleading narratives regarding unsubstantiated widespread election fraud and COVID-19 as key factors contributing to the current heightened threat environment. Yes, you heard me correct. They identify widespread online proliferation of false and misleading narratives regarding unsubstantiated widespread election fraud and COVID-19. So let's decode this. They're not just talking about acts of violence committed to achieve a political or an ideological goal. They are talking about dissent. And what does DHS suggest someone do if they find themselves menaced in the court of public opinion? They want you to report the offender to law enforcement. That's right. Report the offender to law enforcement. Madam President, I've come to the floor time and again to detail just how frightened the American people are of Joe Biden's radical agenda. But this bulletin is the best evidence I've seen to date of just how frightened Joe Biden is of the American people. They must be scared to death over there in that White House. How dare anybody question them? How dare anybody call them into question for the agenda that they have? I'd even go so far as to suggest that this betrays his administration's desire to police the speech, thoughts, and opinions of American citizens and to deputize the public to help keep dissenters in line. The Biden administration is as close as they ever have been to declaring that expressing public disagreement with their agenda is akin to an act of domestic terrorism. Think about this. It isn't just an outrage. It is dangerous for a few different reasons, the most important of which is that it ignores the line differentiating violence and threats from constitutionally protected speech. The former have no place in public discourse. Let me be very clear about that. The former have no place in public discourse. The latter is essential to the functioning of our democracy. Indeed, this nation's democracy, Madam President, one of the reasons that we have stayed free and have stayed a democratic republic is because we share respect for robust, respectful political debate. But it appears with this administration, they've thrown that out the window to say it's our way or it's the highway. We don't want to hear any dissent. We don't want to hear a point, a counterpoint. We don't want to entertain an objection. We're busy. We're busy pushing our socialist agenda. We don't have time for free-thinking, independent individuals to raise their hand and ask a question. It's get in line time. We've got a short window. We've got to make this happen. I would suggest also, Madam President, that it cheapens the horrors of actual terrorism and dilutes the perceived danger of violent extremism. It's an insult to the memories of those who died in the September 11th attacks and the Oklahoma City bombing, and to those who were at gunpoint at a Colleyville, Texas synagogue. But lastly, and most despicably, it suggests that Americans will never be safe until we consent to live in a constant state of fear. According to this bulletin, security is impossible in the face of dissent. It betrays a nightmarish and completely un-American endgame. Today, I sent a letter to Secretary Mayorkas urging him to make it clear that this is just sloppy communication on their part. Madam President, I'd like to submit that letter for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd also like to briefly quote for the record precisely what I asked him to do. I urge you to make very clear to the American public that the Department of Homeland Security does not consider those who disagree with this administration to be domestic terrorists. I further urge you to clarify that the department will not interfere with the rights of all Americans to speak publicly about their political views, including any views that might conflict with the policies and political talking points of this administration. I urge you to revise the bulletin to make clear to the American public that it is decidedly not the role of the Department of Homeland Security to enforce particular narratives or to quash the speech of those who disagree with this administration, end quote. Madam President, this is a very simple request. My hope is that Secretary Mayorkas recognizes his obligation to put everyone at ease by fulfilling it. I can guarantee there are people in my beloved Tennessee that are very upset as they have read this bulletin, because they treasure their free speech. They treasure the ability to have robust political debate. They like talking with their friends and neighbors and having those discussions and seeing if they can pull them to their side of an issue, whether it's a local, a state, or a federal issue. They want to preserve that freedom. This memo says that freedom goes away, that it overrides the Constitution, it overrides the rule of law. If you do it, somebody can report you and it will be considered something not tolerated by this administration. The Biden administration put out this bulletin to highlight a particular danger, but the real danger lies in the document subtext. Even if Secretary Mayorkas makes good on his oath to defend the Constitution, and if he moves forward to revise the bulletin, I fear much damage has already been done. Through this document, the Biden administration has made it abundantly clear that they view dissent as a threat, and that punishing dissent is the cost of maintaining public safety. I wish I could dismiss this as yet another political spat, but the White House is the world's biggest and most powerful bully pulpit. When the Biden administration talks, people listen, and they take them seriously. If what I've laid out today is not the position of the Biden administration, it is their obligation to speak up and to correct the record. As elected representatives, to put ourselves between the American people and any official who would dare tolerate such a dystopian power grab. So also, we should remind those officials that how they feel about our constitutional right to dissent is absolutely irrelevant. I yield the floor. I note the absence.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ask that we suspend the quorum.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent that the following interns and fellows in my office be granted floor privileges for the remainder of this Congress: Jackson Hoppy, David Park, Martin Olliman, Surgeon Semenovic.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to begin by welcoming the Tennessee National Guard's 268th Military Police Company home after a 305-day deployment to Africa. We are so incredibly grateful for their service and for the service and sacrifice that their families make during these times of deployment. And I know I speak for every Tennessean when I say to them, welcome home, job well done. Well, the Senate is back in session, and all anyone back in Tennessee wants to know is, what will this chamber get done next? What is it that the Democrats are going to push next? And they're not feeling very optimistic right now. One thing is clear, and that is that my Democratic colleagues have completely ignored the stress that they're causing Tennessee service members and their families by dangling the NDAA in front of them and then snatching it away. Inaction sends a very powerful message, and right now all they're hearing is that the military has become a political football, and that does not inspire confidence. We have passed the Defense Authorization Act 61 years in a row, and I am confident that there will be bipartisan support for number 62, which makes this tight timeline even more unnecessary. The American people don't have all the details on what this authorization will do, but they don't need them to know that it's the only thing standing between us and getting steamrolled by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the new axis of evil, which is Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Our service members might not know every line item in the 2,000 pages of the bill, but they know that its contents will determine the course of their lives for the next 5, 10, or 25 years. Passing this bill is the bare minimum as far as the Senate is concerned, but it means a lot to our men and women in uniform. Madam President, we're ready to get this thing done. I know that you, as a member of the Armed Services Committee who has worked so hard on this, you join me in being ready to get it done. We finished our committee work back in June on this bill. We considered more than 400 amendments. We adopted about 200 of those amendments, and it passed out of Armed Services Committee 23-3. So when I say we're ready to go, we are. There is bipartisan support for getting this finished. But as we prepare to move forward on this legislation, I want to highlight two of my own proposed amendments that unfortunately fell victim to partisanship. But first, here's a little background. Now, the Tennessee National Guard has a reputation for answering a cry for help no matter where it comes from. Last month, they deployed to Warren County, Tennessee, to help first responders gain control of a wildfire. In September, members of the 194th Engineer Brigade, the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the 230th Sustainment Brigade, and the 230th Assault Helicopter Battalion deployed to Florida to help with the cleanup in the wake of Hurricane Ian. In July, members of Nashville's 230th Assault Helicopter Battalion pulled people to safety after flash floods destroyed communities in Kentucky. This year, the Guard has rescued multiple hikers who got into trouble on or near the Appalachian Trail. And last September, members of the 269th Military Police, the 913th Engineer Company, and the C Company 2nd Battalion, 151st Aviation Regiment made it home after spending more than a year helping law enforcement officials in Texas try to contain the border catastrophe. The sight of that National Guard uniform makes people in this country feel safe when things are going wrong. But the continued enforcement of the COVID-19 vaccination order will inevitably jeopardize that sense of security. I introduced two amendments to the 2023 NDAA that would have injected sanity into these vaccination requirements. The first would have prohibited involuntary separation of any service member for refusing the COVID-19 vaccine until each service achieves its end strength authorized by last year's NDAA. The Second Amendment would have made sure that members of the National Guard or Reserve maintain access to pay and benefits while their request for a religious or health accommodation was pending. This is about as non-controversial as you can get on the issue of vaccine mandates. These amendments would create a simple rule to stop this Biden Department of Defense from railroading their own troops. There is nothing political about preserving readiness and a basic sense of fairness which has been completely absent in this process. I'm going to use the Army as a case study to show you how destructive this mandate has been for the military. Now, the Army has not achieved the end strength authorized in the 2022 NDAA. What does that mean? It means that we don't have enough men and women doing the jobs, filling the slots that the Army has. The data backs this up. If you head over to Fort Campbell and ask anyone in uniform if this is true, they'll tell you that I'm 100% correct. They do not have enough people. Members of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment have been consistently deployed for more than 2 years, and we thank them for that service. I would encourage my Democratic colleagues to ask them what this Democrat-led administration's lack of attention to readiness and force strength could mean for our national security. What kind of impact does this have? This mandate has already separated 1,796 active duty soldiers from their service. What's worse, the Army has only approved less than 4% of medical exemption requests and just over 1% of religious exemption requests. The Guard is still in a holding pattern on the issue of separations, but their exemption denial statistics are just as troubling. 15% of medical exemptions have been approved, but only 0.0047 of religious exemptions. The reserves are not faring much better. The Army has only approved a little more than 5% of the medical exemptions and 0.0044% of their religious exemptions. Prospects are looking bleak for Guardsmen with legitimate exemption claims, and it's pretty bleak for the military as a whole. The National Guard is already missing recruitment goals, and they're set to lose 9,000 members in fiscal year 2023 and 5,000 in fiscal year 2024. In the United States, the number of new service members joining the military has reached a record low. The Army alone fell 10,000 soldiers short of its goal for 2022 and is projecting a deficit of 21,000 soldiers for 2023. This administration knew manpower was a problem, but still they chose to fire service members who were perfectly healthy and ready to defend this great country. And so we shouldn't be surprised that 18-year-olds in this country don't feel that they can trust this Democrat-led administration at the Pentagon with full control of their young lives. The fact is, the Democrats have a perfect record of making decisions that end in a disaster. They spent trillions of dollars, provoked record-breaking inflation, and hired 87,000 new IRS agents to squeeze small businesses who are struggling to survive in communities all across the wonderful state of Tennessee. They've abandoned the southern border, and they've caused the worst illegal immigration crisis we have ever seen, the worst humanitarian crisis we've seen. And remember, it would be even worse if the Tennessee National Guard hadn't come to the rescue. They latched onto the Green New Deal and erased American energy independence. They backed shutdowns and mandates that destroyed the American workforce. They shuttered American businesses and sent our supply chains into a shambles. And let's be clear, they didn't make these decisions blindly. They had the same data that each member of this chamber has. They watched the news. They knew what they were doing. They knew it was wrong. They did it anyway. It was intentional. They are focused on an outcome. And now they're applying that same destructive strategy to the members of the U.S. military. Every year we come into this chamber and fight as hard as we can to make our military the most lethal fighting force in the world. We authorize billions of dollars for aircraft, for equipment, for weaponry. The NDAA represents an incredible investment in the future of this country, but it also represents the trust the American people put in this Congress to keep them safe and to keep the enemy at bay. I join my Republican colleagues, Madam President, in asking Leader Schumer to bring the NDAA to the floor so that we can get this very important piece of legislation to the President's desk. There is no reason for delay. And I also implore all my colleagues to remember that the greatest military in the world is nothing without the brave men and women and their families who have volunteered to be a part of it. We ask so much of them. They're already busy enough putting out fires, fighting wars. The least we can do is spare them the pain of fighting our political battles. I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President, for over a year, officials in the Biden administration have operated under the assumption that if they keep repeating their far-left propaganda, they'll be able to trick the American people into believing that everything is okay. Don't believe what you see. Don't believe what you're reading. Don't believe what you're hearing from friends and neighbors. Just believe us. Everything's fine. Prices aren't high, crime's not high, borders not open. Everything's just fine. Problem is, Tennesseans know better than to believe this. They have figured it out. They know that the economy is not in a good place. They know high gas prices aren't Putin's fault. And they know that spikes in crime and drug overdoses, this is not normal. But most importantly, they know that standing aside and letting the country fall apart is not what a normal presidential administration does. It is far from it. The White House has worked overtime trying to convince the American people that reports of the chaos along our southern border are exaggerated. This is one of the most dangerous falsehoods the Biden administration has tried to sell. And here is why. In May, this month of May this year, Border Patrol encountered more than 177,000 unique individuals trying to cross the border. Border Patrol doesn't have the manpower or the resources to control this wave of illegal immigration. I know it. I think my Democratic colleagues know it. Certainly the ones that have taken the time to go to the border know it. And no doubt the Biden administration knows it. As I said, in May of this year, 177,000 different individuals were encountered trying to cross that border. Now, Tennesseans are very worried about this, and they want to know why the president is not worried about this. For goodness sakes, he has never taken the time to go to the border. He's had 5 decades to go down there and look at the border, and he's never taken the time to do it. It really is pretty simple. For we the people, the citizenry of this country, the issue of whether the Democrats wish this country well is no longer up for debate. They know that the left has abandoned them, the people. They know that. They're seeing it every single day, whether they're shopping for groceries, filling up the car. They see it. They see it by the crime in the streets, the gangs. They know it. They see it with the human trafficking and the suffering and the drugs that are killing precious American lives. Now, unfortunately, President Biden lost the opportunity to persuade the American people otherwise on day one of his administration, when he chose to turn the American Southwest into a free-for-all. Since then, things have only gotten more dangerous. During the first 4 days of this month, law enforcement officials arrested 3 members of MS-13, an 18th Street gang member, and multiple convicted sex offenders as they tried to enter the country. On July 6th, they seized more than 1,000 pounds of meth from one single smuggler. That's right, one smuggler. Do you think the drug dealers are emboldened? Think about that, 1,000 pounds of meth. So far this year, they've seized more than 8,000 pounds of fentanyl, which is enough to kill a small country. And here is the question I would pose to the president. How many people and how many pounds of drugs made it in while Border Patrol agents were busy with the smugglers and criminals they managed to catch? Where did the gotaways go? What did the gotaways have with them? Well, that is a rhetorical question. We know exactly where they went, and we know what they've got with them. And you know what, Madam President? They are coming to our own cities, communities, towns, our own backyards. My Democratic colleagues may be happy to ignore the problem, but on behalf of Tennesseans, I will not ignore the problem. The threat is too great. If you ask any law enforcement officer, they'll tell you this issue of the southern border, it is a matter of life and death. Not just on the border, Madam President, but in each of our 95 counties in the state of Tennessee, in each of our towns and cities. This open border is a matter of life and death. In Tennessee, our sheriffs and police chiefs want the border secured. And I've got to tell you, to so many Tennesseans, it is laughable that a White House spokesman would stand behind that podium and look at the people and say, the border is secure? Who do they think they're talking to? Do they think that people are not watching the footage? Whether they're watching it on TV or streaming it or looking at it on social media, Madam President, they can see that this border is not secure. They're talking to friends and relatives that live in a border state, that live along that border. And they're telling them some of the horrific stories that they're witnessing every single day in their communities. We know for a fact that the cross-border drug trade is alive and well. Who's getting rich off this open southern border? Take a guess. The drug cartels. The drug cartels. Enormous profits, growing to a global organization. That's right, global. So far this year, people from 150 different countries have come across our southern border. Chinese nationals, they're not trying to come in here on a visa. They don't wish us well. Chinese Communist Party, they're hard at work. Chinese Communist Party, they're paying the cartels $50,000 a pop to get people into our country that they want to, but bringing them across the southern border. The Tennessean, which is our newspaper in Nashville, Tennessee, recently reported a truly horrific story about a multi-million-dollar crime ring operating right out of Middle Tennessee. That's right. The drug cartels, they're not fearful because Joe Biden has the welcome mat out, border open. The kingpin was working directly with the Sinaloa drug cartel. Now, that is the one that primarily has the Arizona border. That is the one that is bringing a majority of the drugs through Arizona. They like to focus on fentanyl. And the traffickers that were working underneath this hoodlum are as brutally violent as their friends down in Mexico. We know they are responsible for multiple horrific assaults, kidnappings, at least one murder, and the mutilation of a 22-year-old woman. They're also linked to a local gang that terrorizes the streets of Nashville. That's right, a drug kingpin working directly with the Sinaloa cartel. And that is what they are doing in Tennessee. The violence does not stop at the border. The violence in this country increases because of that open border and because of the unwillingness of this administration to do anything about it. This violence is bleeding into every town, every state, and it will not stop until we have leaders in the White House and an administration who are willing to put themselves in between these monsters and the American people. The fact that we can't talk about this without provoking hysteria in the ranks of the Democratic Party tells me we're heading in the wrong direction. But don't take my word for it. Just read a number of the polls that are out there. I hope the president takes to heart that 33% job approval rating that the New York Times reported on today. That is about as significant a message as could be sent to this administration. Only 33% of the American people approve of what this administration is doing. This administration has normalized things that even 5 years ago would have shocked the conscience of your average Democrat. We talk about spending in trillions of dollars now, $1 trillion here and there, $6 trillion for COVID. Let's spend another $2 trillion on Build Back Broke. The numbers just keep piling up. We talk about apprehending 170,000 people at the border in a month, not in a year, but in a month. We talk about drug seizures in measures of pounds, not ounces. You know, Madam President, I was talking with one of our sheriffs in Tennessee, and we were talking about this issue. And he said, you know, Marsha, we used to apprehend drugs, and it would be in grams or it would be in ounces. And now, nearly every seizure is in pounds. That's the change. The drug cartels are not fearful of being caught or stopped at that border. They have figured it out. And sadly, this is life in Joe Biden's America. But none of this, none of it, nothing, not one part of what you're seeing in Joe Biden's America is compatible with an optimistic vision for the future. With that phrase, a more perfect union, equal justice, equal opportunity, none of it. Why? When Tennesseans look at what Joe Biden and the Democrats are doing, what they're seeing is a political machine acting like they're on a deadline. They are burning through an agenda that the American people did not ask for, and they definitely do not want. Do they want higher taxes? Absolutely not. Do they want an open border? They've said time and again, no. Do they want higher crime? No. Do they want drugs? Fentanyl, killing 71,000 Americans in a year? No. No. Do they want the highest inflation that we have had in 40 years? No. Do they want a foreign policy that doesn't work? That we have a disaster in Afghanistan? We have the Chinese Communist Party after we have Russia and Putin out here acting like they're in control. We have the axis of evil, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, out trying to recruit friends and allies into their axis of evil to not wish us well. Is that what the American people want? No, it is not. Do they want mandates? Do they want lockdowns? No, they do not. That is not what they want. The people of this country still have a vision for the future, but it's hard to keep hope alive when the people in control of the government have obviously lost control of this country. I love going around Tennessee, and I love having great conversations with people who will tell you they're Democrats or Republicans, and they want to know if the Democratic Party is delusional. Are they obsessed with the socialist agenda? Are they out of touch with what it feels like to not have money to fill up the gas tank, to not have money to buy that full bag of groceries? The idea that their president would allow our border to be open to drug cartels and smugglers to take advantage of us, the people, terrifies Tennesseans. But it also is something that makes them angry because they know Joe Biden could do something about this if he wanted to. They know that the Democratic Party, which runs everything in this town, the House, the Senate, the White House, they could do something about this if they chose to. Law enforcement, Border Patrol, and advocates who work with drug addicts and the victims of human smuggling are in almost unanimous agreement on a few points. First, what I have heard from them is this president, President Biden, must keep Title 42 in place until there is a plan for how they would replace it. Title 42 is essential. This president must embrace a Remain in Mexico policy. And this president must do what the Border Patrol have asked to be done for 3 decades, and that is to build the wall and give them the tools they need to get their job done. These are all things that President Biden could choose to do right now. So, why is he refusing to take an action? If you know, the American people would really like to have an answer, because they look at the chaos coming from this administration, the chaos at the border, the chaos on our streets, and they know that this country deserves better. I yield the floor. The Biden administration has made a name for itself attacking the very institutions that they were sworn to protect. If you look at what's happening outside Washington right now, you can see the ripple effects of this institutional sabotage. There's inflation, there are shortages, there's crime, there are drugs flooding our communities. This weekend, I was chatting with one of my politically independent-minded friends back home, and here's what she told me. She said, everything the Democrats are doing is making my life harder. It makes things worse. Last Tuesday, I held a telephone town hall with a few thousand Tennesseans, and they told me the same thing. I spoke to a dad from Chattanooga, and something he said really struck me. He was telling me about how worried he is about his children's future, and said the only common thread he can see tying all this together is suffering. Think about that. A dad who is looking at the actions of the Democrat-controlled House, Senate, and White House, and to him, he is perceiving the intent to inflict suffering. He asked me what the goal is of all this, referring, of course, to Biden's agenda. He couldn't figure it out, and I really don't blame him. No reasonable person can look at what the Biden administration has done and say that they feel like that administration has our best interest at heart, or that they have a vision for the future of the country. What they do have is an agenda, a to-do list, and it seems sometimes they struggle with that. To Tennesseans, this government, under this administration, with this leadership, it is all broken. It's broken, and nowhere has this been more pronounced than in President Biden's refusal to support law enforcement, both down on the border and in our local communities. Since day one, the president has done everything in his power to sabotage the tens of thousands of people the Department of Homeland Security employs to secure the homeland. He has done this knowing full well that international criminal organizations, terrorist cartels, are taking advantage of his lack of action. In fact, business has never been better for the drug dealers and the human traffickers. At times, they are raking in as much as $100 million a week. That's right. Who is profiting? It is the cartels that are pushing drugs, pushing fentanyl, that are pushing gangs, that are pushing sex trafficking, the cartels that have turned themselves into global organizations, bringing people last year from 160 different countries to our southern border to do what? To enter illegally, to claim asylum, to ask the U.S. taxpayer to finish the journey for them to wherever they are wanting to go. This is what the people are seeing. Now, Mr. President, take a look at what is happening in our own backyard, if you will. 2021, almost 108,000 Americans died from a drug overdose. About 4,000 of these were Tennesseans, all tragic losses. Law enforcement in Benton County, Tennessee, told me recently that about 80% of the drugs they seize contain fentanyl, which, as we all know, is deadly in very small amounts. Ask any law enforcement officer where these drugs are coming from, and they will tell you that the majority of this is coming across the southern border. The cartel mules are smuggling it right across that border. Our Border Patrol, they're overworked, they're underfunded, they're understaffed, they're working overtime, they're doing their best, but they can't get it all. They look at the surveillance cameras, they see the gotaways, they know that they're coming. If the Biden administration abandons their Title 42 authority at some point in the future, it's going to get worse. We'll have a small town of Tennessee, the equivalent in population of a small town in Tennessee, coming right across that border. In Tennessee, we've got 345 towns. 90% of those are 18,000 in population or less. Mr. President, when you look at Connecticut, you've got 215 towns. 187 or 87% of those are, you've got it, 18,000 or less in population. If you look at the state of Maryland, 536 towns, 458 of those, 18,000 or less in population. That's 85.4%. Now think about that. That number of people crossing the border every single day. And all the traffickers, the drug traffickers, human traffickers, all the gangs, all they have to do, blend in, come on in. I'd like to say that until the Biden administration wises up and secures the border, every town will be a border town and every state will be a border state. The problems associated with drugs and criminal activity don't stay in New Mexico or Arizona or Texas or California. They bleed into the rest of the country and into the hands of local law enforcement. They have enough to be dealing with. Here's some stats for you. In 2021, homicides in U.S. cities reached a near record high. The number of law enforcement officers intentionally killed on the job was the highest since 9/11, and ambush-style attacks on police increased 115%. Meanwhile, earlier this year, the Biden administration floated the idea of using yet another executive order to limit law enforcement's access to resources and federal grant money. Between the defund the police movement and this half-hearted support from their president, it is no wonder that law enforcement officers are resigning or quitting or retiring in record numbers. I would ask the President and Secretary Mayorkas and my Democratic colleagues to listen to what those who have sworn to protect and serve are telling them, because they know what the Biden administration needs to do. This administration would be well served to keep Title 42 until we have a plan to replace it. Embrace the Remain in Mexico policy and do what law enforcement has asked for decades. Build a wall. They need that barrier. Give them technology, better technology, and more officers and agents. That's what they need. They continue to ask for it. Give them what they need to do their job, to protect this country. As it stands, Democrats have abandoned Border Patrol, abandoned local law enforcement, and according to my friends in Tennessee, they have abandoned we, the people. And the people are losing faith. They look at the White House and they have no idea who is in charge. They don't see their concern for the future reflected in the actions of the president or his staff, who repeatedly corrects him. They don't see a vision for America. All they see is a to-do list, an agenda that will fail them over and over again because it leads to more government